All right, so this week, somebody erased my board, which hurt my feelings. That's all right. But they never erased that board. I've never quite figured that out. But, but that's all right, because the law of 5 of motivation has quite a few different things in it, and we will try to hit those pretty quickly today. But I just wanted to ask the question, what motivates you when you really pretty much do anything? What do you use for motivation? If you set a boundary, if you don't set a boundary, if you do something for somebody, or if you don't do something for somebody, what is your motivation? What do you use for motivation?
The outcome, the end state goal.
Say that again. The outcome?
The outcome, the end state goal. Visualizing what that's going to look like.
The end state goal. All right. And so the outcome, sometimes the motivation of getting the thing done, right? How many of you like to set goals? Anybody like to set goals? Anybody? All right. So one of the things we talk about in my counseling process is goals and setting goals. And sometimes they ask, hey, what's your 1-year goal? What's your 3-year goal? What's your 5-year goal? How many in business have ever been asked by their boss to write out, or a company policy says you need to write out your 1, 3, 5, 10-year goal for working for the company? Anybody ever experienced that? Hey, what's your 1-day goal? Because sometimes it's just making it through the day. That is all I happen to do. And one of the things that one of my supervisors taught me in work and training for the counseling is they say, we don't even know whether our clients can make it 10 minutes, much less a week. So when we assign homework within the counseling process, we need to make sure we take into account what they believe their ability is. So it might be, you said, okay, for this week, I want you to take 30 minutes every night and sit down with your spouse and have a really in-depth conversation. All right, number one, don't raise your hand because you'll all get fired. All right, how many of you want to do that for 7 straight days, 30 minutes a day? Have a real in-depth conversation with your spouse.
Don't raise your hand.
I was going to say, but it presupposes that the spouse wants to do the same thing.
Well, in a counseling process, hopefully I have both spouses in there, right? But we don't know that they can get 5 minutes, 3 minutes, 2 minutes, 1 minute, 10 minutes. We don't know. We don't know what they're able to do. We've really got to be able to ask them, how much do you think you can do? And then they have to have the motivation to be willing to do that, right? What's the motivation of that? Well, maybe we don't want the marriage to be like this. Maybe we don't want the marriage to be like that. We don't like life to continue like this. We don't want life to continue like that. What's our motivation, right? How many of you sometimes, don't raise your hand, this is a rhetorical question probably across the board, is how many of you are motivated by fear?
By what?
Fear. The fear of something occurring. The fear of something happening. If you take a look at the first 4 on this list under the thought of the law of motivation, what motivates us to set boundaries, what motivates us to respect somebody else's boundaries, we take a look at that, we say, what he's got down here is he's got 4 right off the top are motivated by what? Fear. Fear of a negative occurrence, right? So don't raise your hand. How many of you are afraid to say something to your spouse because you're afraid the way they're going to react?
We've been married so long, it's not anymore.
I don't care what they think no more. Like it, don't like it. Leave, don't leave. I don't care no more. Right? How many of us are afraid to say something to our children because we're afraid of the way they will respond to us? Oh, okay. Absolutely. Well, we talked about that last week just a little bit. We don't know how to approach them because we're afraid of how she's going to respond, maybe even more how the boyfriend or husband is going to respond and drive her, right? That was one of the things we talked about last week, right? How many of us are afraid to say something to our parents, adult children, because we're afraid of how they will respond? Man, if I say this, she's going to stop talking to me, or hey, she's going to stop engaging with me, or hey, it's going to be a never-ending onslaught. Husbands, how many of you are afraid to say something to your wife? Maybe if you spent a lot of money, didn't tell them. Or you did something and you didn't realize it, or I've had a client recently that the husband was supposed to go on a trip with them, but he had gotten a new job. and he was afraid to ask the new job or tell the new job when they hired him, actually, that they already had this trip planned. He was afraid to tell not only his boss about this trip already planned, but then he was afraid to do what? Tell his wife that he hadn't told the boss. He's jacked on both sides of this deal. There's no winning for this guy, is there?
Yeah.
Right? You know, how many of you have known wives or are wives that are afraid to say something to their husband negative because of the way that they will respond?
I have a fear of disappointment. Like,
Fear
I
of
don't say
disappointment.
things. There's something I'm keeping from my mom because I'm afraid of her disappointment. Like,
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
How big of a motivator do you feel fear is?
A big one.
It is a huge motivator. How many of you go to church because you're afraid of hell? Is that your only motivation? Is that the motivation that God wants? I'm afraid of being judged by you. You know, I argue that there is a reasonable, respectable fear, especially for children of a parent, right? It's the same one that we have for God, that we understand that that parent has the ability to judge us and sentence us and carry out the sentence. But we have to believe that the sentence is fair and equitable and reasonable, don't we? So we have a reasonable fear of that parent, right? Don't raise your hands, yet again rhetorical, but how many of you had a parent that you were not able to feel that way about? You were actually afraid of that parent. So you wouldn't tell them things, or you would do your best to stay out of the house, right? That creates the avoider situation where they just get out of the house as soon as they can. Kids are gone, right? They don't come back. Fear is a massive motivator in what we do. Now, I mean, this law of motivation, he's talking about negative things here. This particular set of this particular law itself is based on the negatives of motivation. What motivates us not to do what we should do. So he says, fear of loss, love, or them leaving. He used the word abandonment. That's a great big word. I wasn't going to write it there. Right? And so we are afraid that if we say something, do something, or create a boundary, you will no longer talk to me like that. You will no longer engage with me like that. You will no longer treat me like that. You hit me again, I'm out. Afraid to do that because we're afraid of loss, love, or leaving. You might think on the other side of that, hearing that from the outside, they need to leave that person. They need to get away from that person. They need to. Well, we don't always know the whole situation. I hear a lot of things within my counseling practice that you would never thought it. You would have never expected it. You would have never believed that that was the situation. But yet, they're terrified of losing that person. They're an absolute monster to me. And by the way, this is not just males that are that way. There are women out there that the guy is afraid of losing, and that woman is a terror. How many of you know a woman like that? Don't raise your hand. Now look at your spouse. All right? But we are. The fear of losing whatever it is a huge motivator. I'm afraid to tell my child that I disapprove of this, that, or whatever because I'm afraid of losing them. I'm afraid of telling my spouse that this thing happened because I'm afraid of them no longer loving me or leaving me. Huge motivator. The second one, fear of the other's anger. I can't tell them that because they're going to freak out. And when they freak out, they become this wonderful word called unpredictable. Anybody unpredictable? Mm-hmm. I've been. I probably am. I'm very unpredictable. So sometimes people are afraid to tell me things because they don't quite know how he's going to respond. And I might lose my mind one day, and the next day, don't laugh. You be quiet over there. Seen that? Okay.
We know.
Right? People are afraid of others' anger. Arguably, this is a response. I think that this word could even be along the lines of afraid of the other's response. Not just anger, but response in general, right? We're afraid of others' response in this particular situation. Right? Right? Don't raise your hand, but how many of you have this? In this room, I would argue probably a third of us in some form have that. We're afraid to say it. We're afraid to tell our little kid no because of, you know how many mothers are afraid to tell their children no? Oh, he just says he hates me. Or she hates me. Do you really think that kid hates you? But that child has learned that they can manipulate you by what? Certain phrases. I have lots of young people come in whose parents are freaked out because they use the word suicide. I'm just going to kill myself.
Here's the rope.
I'm
sorry.
Whoa.
Was that too much? Inappropriate.
That is 100% what I do. I kid you not. Tell them if you're going to do it, get on with it. Because you're not going to use that against me. Because if they find out, they can use certain phrases. Now, it's not just suicide or I'm going to kill myself. There's all kinds of phrases out there. If they find out, if that person finds out that controls you, guess what their go-to is at that point?
It's leverage.
It becomes leverage. You know how powerful leverage is? My oldest son is 6'6", about 360 pounds, and I can take him down. You know why? Because I understand a concept called leverage. Leverage. Right? I may not be very strong, but I'm fairly intelligent, and you can use leverage. Right? They learn how to use leverage against you. We're afraid of the anger. Right? We're afraid of their response. So I just don't say it. Right? I'm reading Jordan Peterson's next book called The Next 12 Rules or whatever it is. And that's something he just recently talked about, was we're afraid of their response and the leverage they use against us. But we cannot be afraid of having the conversation, even if the conversation is awful, ugly, and miserable. You know what's worse? Holding it in. Right? What the proverbial straw that broke the camel's back? You just keep piling it on until eventually it becomes what? Y'all ever seen the people do the rubber bands around the watermelon?
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
What's the purpose?
Pressure.
How many rubber bands can I put on this watermelon before it what?
Explodes.
And sometimes, if you're watching it, they don't even have to put the rubber band all the way on. They just get it over the top of it, and it pops. That's just the last straw. It's the last rubber band, right? So we're afraid because we don't know what that last thing is going to be, right? People are afraid of what? They're afraid of being lonely, right? If they say something, how many of you deal with somebody in your life, yet again, rhetorical, that uses silence, rejection, and what's the word I'm looking for? Silence, rejection, I guess silence and rejection.
Shunning.
Shunning, great word. To deal with their frustration. I just won't talk to them. Some people are like, oh, it'd be blissful. If I say this, they'll be quiet for the next 3 days. Guess what happens after the 3 days? Anyway. But people are afraid of loneliness because they will get shunned. They will get shut out of that person's what? Life. Right? How many of you wish your children would shut them out of your life? Right? But anybody have the child that you made them mad and they don't talk to you for 4 days?
Brother.
Siblings?
A sibling.
Yeah.
Brother.
I made them mad so they stopped talking to me. They didn't talk to me for 3 days. Didn't hear from them for 3 or 4 days. They were mad at me, right? Arguably, even though it sometimes makes you feel better than one that's doing it, shunning. How do you spell that? Shunning. Anyway, close enough. Right? Shunning to you feels effective. But what is it? Which is more damaging? Having the argument or shunning? I'm going to say shunning. I would agree. The next one, fourth one, fear of losing the good in who? I'm afraid to set this boundary because I think it's going to do what? Change me. If I do that, I'm going to lose something about myself. I'm going to give up something about myself. I think this one's a little bit weird in theory of what it is, but I'll read you what he writes about it. He says, fear of losing the good inside. He says, we are made to love. As a result, when we are not loving, we are in pain. Many people cannot say, I love you and I do not want to do that. Such a statement does not make sense to them. They think that love means to always say what?
Yes.
If you loved me, you'd... How many of you taught your young ladies to watch out for that when they date? Because boys are scummy. Boys are scummy. And they will tell you whatever you want to hear to do what? Sex. They want to get in your pants. And they'll say whatever it is. But I love you. And if you loved me, you would X, Y, or Z. Did you know that theory carries well into adulthood? Not just for men. Well, if you loved me, you'd. We're afraid to not say yes because we think Christians are told to never tell somebody no. Christians have to be a doormat. Christians have to be, well, if they want your tunic, you give them your... Well, if they want your cloak, you give them your tunic. If they press you to walk 1 mile, you walk. Turn your cheek. If they strike you, turn. You are to forgive them 70 times 7, which is not a real number, right? 490 times and I'm done, right? That's what it is. That's not what that means, right? It's a matter of the heart. What's the point? We mean to do what's best by somebody, but sometimes we have to say
No.
no. And if you remember, we talked about that because Jesus himself even said sometimes you don't cast your pearls before swine, right? You sometimes have to be able to say no because all of the yeses you have said have never changed a single thing. Well, maybe if I just say yes this one time, it'll make things better. Anybody ever thought that, Darjay? Anybody ever felt that? Well, maybe if I just say yes this time, it'll stop whatever it is. If I just, and it's not always the word yes, it's if I give in, if I agree to, if I whatever. If I just sacrifice my will, desire, life, or soul, it'll make this relationship better. You believe that? Continuing to submit yourself to that kind of thing does not make it better. What it does is it emboldens the person to the next thing. Right? So it's like the kid says, Mommy can have a cookie, Mommy can have a cookie, Mommy can have a cookie. No. And finally you say, okay, here, have a cookie. That child did not learn, hey, Mommy was nice and gave me a cookie. That child says, now I need to do it 5 times to get the cookie. And then the next time it's what? And then. But they will continue to do what?
Hope your last nerve.
Oh, every single bit of that last nerve doing the trolley dance on it, right? They're just having a good old time. All right, because that's what it is. Did you know adults still do that? Husbands, wives, adult children, you to your parents, we still do that. Bosses, you to the bosses, you to friends and family and the dog, all right? We do that. Come here, love me. It keeps going that way, right? So, we're afraid of saying no because we think we always have to say yes. There is nothing in Scripture that tells you you are required to always say yes. God does not require you to say yes to Him. Now, in order for you to gain the salvation, gain is a hard word, to receive the salvation that He's offered you, you are required to say yes to Him. But He does not do what? Because He gives you this thing called free will, and you have no right to take that will from anybody else as well, nor you have a right to take it from yourself. 5th one is guilt. We feel guilty. No, well, maybe I should. Or we're afraid of feeling guilty. Could arguably be the argument there is, all right, so how many of us overcommit ourselves to things because we don't know how to say no? You know how many teachers within the church program are afraid to step down from teaching, even though they're tired or whatever it is, because of, well, nobody else wants to teach the class, or people. We feel guilty. Anybody ever feel guilty? Guilty to say no? Guilty to turn away from something? What's your motivation? I'm motivated to continue to sacrifice myself for something because I feel guilty for not doing it. And so we overextend ourselves to the point where we what? Break down. Anybody ever don't raise your hand. Anybody ever broke down? Anybody ever crashed? Anybody ever had that kind of moment where you just absolutely crashed? Because I am doing too much. I'm sorry. It's a little steamy in here. You know, one of the things that Sherry had a bad habit of doing for a long time is she'd overcommit. I want to do it, I want to do it, I want to do it, I want to do it. You know, and people would say, you want to do this, you want to do this, you want to do this. And then she would get herself so combobulated that she ends up what? Crashing. Right? And so finally, we worked on that to say that, listen, no. I told her that before you commit to anything, do what? Tell me. Let's talk about it before you commit to it. Do you have time for it? I will ask the question she doesn't ask herself. Do not say yes immediately. Tell them you need to talk to your husband about it. I don't really do anything without saying I'm going to talk to Sherry. Let me talk to Sherry about it. Oh, does your wife make out your decision for you? Yes, she does. I don't care what you think about that because life is easier. We're afraid of payback. Anybody ever afraid of somebody getting even with them? Well, I did this so they might do that. Oh, I'm afraid to stand up to that person because, man, I saw what they did to that person. You know, that's how children learn not to get beat at home. All right? Because they saw what happened to their siblings, and so they what? They don't do it. You know, I learned that. My dad told me that story one time. I said, Dad, yeah, I got in a lot of trouble for that thing I did, but David did the same thing. He said, yeah, and you should have learned from it. Have I not used that with you guys? All right. My children didn't learn very well. All right. So, payback. We're afraid of what something might do to us, to our family, to our friends, to our community. Because that person will go out and... That's what the narcissist does, by the way. If you don't want to know the true power of a narcissist, is the power they try to exert over your community. It's not enough to get mad at you. They then want to turn everybody in your world against you. That is their power, or their assumed power. And we've seen it done to people, and it terrifies you. Man, I saw what they did to this person, and I don't want to be on the business end of that. Because if you disappoint them, it is not about forgiveness, grace, and understanding. It's about, I will get you and your little dog too. Anybody ever met that person? Don't be that person. You ever met that person? We are motivated by, this one's maybe a positive, but it could be a negative, but we are motivated by approval. If I say no, then they are going to be what? What's the word? Disappointed, a little squiggly eye. Disappointed. They will be disappointed in me. Oh, my little junior looks so sad because I told him he couldn't have a cookie. Don't have a cookie. No, that's a grandparent problem, by the way. Because we don't want our kid being disappointed in us, so we give them cookies. Right? Whatever they want, I don't care. Right? Right? As Bill Cosby said, these are old people trying to get into heaven. Right? Disappointed. We are afraid of people being disappointed in us. We're afraid of letting people down. Approval can go a lot of ways. We're afraid of them not asking us again. I had a particular client come in one time and make a comment that said, I don't want to go on this thing that my friends have come up with, but if I don't go, I'm afraid they won't ask me again.
You said you would never tell me
I don't know what to tell you. But they were afraid of the approval of the group. They were afraid of getting payback. Payback would be they didn't get to go. Do you notice how they stack up, by the way? They kind of stack on top of each other. You start to feel all these different things. I'm afraid they're not going to love me anymore. I'm afraid they're going to get mad at me. I'm afraid I'm going to be shunned by them. Right? I'm going to feel bad because I don't think I'm doing what I'm supposed to do. I feel guilty all for the whole flipping thing. They're going to get me back. Oh, yeah, they think they got me. You just wait. Anybody ever felt that way? You ever said that about your spouse? Yeah, I'll get them. I'm afraid of their approval. And then the last one said, we over-identify with the other's loss. This is an interesting one. Because I know how it felt when that happened to me. And I don't want anybody else to feel that way. I know what it felt like when this person did that to me. And I want to make sure I don't cause somebody else to feel that way. Anybody ever felt that?
What is it? Say it again. What?
Over-identification with the other's
And
loss.
describe it again. What is
It is, I have experienced what their hurt,
Okay.
and I don't want to cause that hurt to them. I have experienced what they're about to feel if I say no or do whatever it is or set the boundary. And so I don't want to do that because I have experienced it and I don't want anybody else to feel that way. Anybody ever said that? Man, I just don't want anybody else to feel that way.
Is that the case when you have experienced something like that during childhood and then you don't want your child to have to go through that as well? Is that
Oh, absolutely. I would, absolutely. Well, it's projecting. You're projecting your experience on somebody else. Right? How healthy is projection? Raise your hand if you think on the scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the best, projection is a 10 good. How many think it's a 0 good? I don't know that it's a 0. I'd say more about a 4 because I think projection helps us understand other people's situations. I think projection can be good in some situations where we project our emotions and our experiences onto another person or another situation or something. But we can be well overdone in the area of projection. We can over-identify with their loss because, man, I felt that and I don't want anybody else to feel that. That was the worst feeling I ever felt. And then you do. So you don't do it because you're afraid of them experiencing what you felt because then you're going to feel what? Guilty. Or guilt. You're going to feel guilt for it. I caused this pain and I know exactly what they're experiencing. By the way, you do not know exactly what they're experiencing by anyways because you're not them and you're not in their head. But you can sympathize and empathize with them in a particular given situation, and we're afraid to do it. You see how it is? Our motivation is to do certain things and arguably to not set the appropriate boundaries is because, right, we're afraid that they will not love us anymore. They're afraid they're going to get mad at us and give us a negative response. We're afraid of being shunned by them. We're afraid of feeling bad about ourselves, being guilty for saying that, them getting back at us. We don't want to disappoint anybody. And Lord help us, we don't want them to experience maybe what we've experienced in the past. You can do one of these or all of these in any given situation. Right? So when you take a look at it, you almost look at what's the opposite. Because all of this really comes down to what's the worst that could actually happen. So you make them mad. So they never talk to you again. Arguably, if they're not going to talk to you again over something you said no to, you probably don't need to be friends with them anyway. You don't need to engage with them. There are boundaries with family that I may have to accept these as the outcome of this law, as the outcome of our experience, because they are not worth the toxic pain they create. It's just not worth it. All right, everybody. Thank you all for your comments. Thank you for your time. I think I talked more in this class than most, and I apologize. But thank you all for your time. Next week, we are doing, this is a weird one, the law of evaluation. And so we'll pick that up next week. Y'all have a great week. Enjoy the rain.